We are honoured to have Mr. Simon Millman, member for Mount Lawley, here with us today in his capacity as Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Millman will be representing the Honourable Amber Jade Sanderson, Minister for Health and Mental Health. So we'd like to invite him to open up the public lecture. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Do you want me to stand? Yeah.
Oh, no, you can.
I can stand wherever?
You can stand.
Fantastic.
Should be mic all the way.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, my name is Simon Millman. I'm the Parliamentary Secretary to Amber Jade Sanderson, who's the WA Minister for Health. Firstly, I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the custodians of the land on which we meet, Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Bunyama people, the traditional owners of the land where Wittenoom is located. I'd also like to acknowledge friends of mine in the Injibunny and Nalama Aboriginal communities in the Pilbara, across whose land asbestos was often transported from the Wittenoom mine to Cape Lambert and Port Sampson before being shipped down to Fremantle and unloaded. My name is Simon Millman. I was very keen when I saw this event come through in the Minister's diary. For those of you who don't know, I was elected to Parliament in 2017, but before I was elected to Parliament, I worked at Slater & Gordon Lawyers for about 12 years, starting in 2004. And during my time there, I saw the incredible bravery, the incredible strength of spirit, the incredible fortitude and thirst for justice that victims of asbestos-related diseases showed. And they were an inspiration to me in my practice of law. So for those of you who know or who work with or support victims of asbestos-related diseases, can I commend you for the incredible work that you do. To the researchers, the clinicians, the academics who are in the room who are trying to find solutions to the problems that we face as a result of asbestos exposure, can I congratulate you for what you've achieved so far. Western Australia, Perth, the NCARD are world leaders when it comes to understanding and appreciation of both the dangers of asbestos and the nature and consequences of the disease. When it comes to, so that's all by way of background. When it comes to dealing with issues that persist in the community, the question of asbestos hasn't been resolved. One of the challenges that we face is that periodically it falls out of our consciousness. Periodically there are other issues that come to the fore, and we forget that there are people out there in the community who are still being exposed to asbestos because of the long latency periods for diseases such as mesothelioma, when you've got exposure decades, 10, 20, 30, sometimes 40 years before the onset of symptoms. There are people in the community right now who've been exposed to asbestos dust and fibres who don't yet know whether or not they will suffer the consequences of the disease. And so that has a really pernicious emotional effect as people wait to see whether or not they'll be one of the unlucky ones for whom their number comes up. So can I commend the clinicians, Professor Fraser and Dr. Melvin Chin for the work that you do, but also for raising awareness in the public consciousness. Can I particularly commend Narelle Towie, the freelance journalist and head of the journalism school at Curtin University, for what you do in raising the public awareness. Murdoch. Beg your pardon, Murdoch University, for what you're doing in raising public awareness around this really important issue. Can I finish by acknowledging NCARD, the work that NCARD does, bringing all of these disparate groups and organisations together as a focal point. The work that you do through this public lecture series is a real testament to the organisation and something that I'd love to see you continue into the future. I'd like to acknowledge, as I close, Melina Markey, obviously my great friend from the Asbestos Diseases Society, with who I was able to work closely for a long period of time, and also in her absence, Anna Nowak from NCARD. And now that I've heard that he's online, the Honourable Robin Chappell, just going to finish by saying we often talked about asbestos and asbestos-related issues when Robin and I sat together on the Joint Select Committee into End-of-Life Choices. His retirement from the Parliament under extenuating circumstances was a great sense of sadness for me. He made a fantastic contribution, and he's a loss to the Parliament. Robin, if you can hear me, technology is working. I hope you're going well. I miss having you around, and I look forward to seeing you again shortly. Have a great lecture, everybody. I'm personally looking forward to the contributions that people have to make. And so thank you very much for having me. And that's all I have to say.
Well, without further ado, we've already had a bit of an introduction, so welcome Narelle Towie. Narelle is a at Murdoch University. But she's an award-winning journalist, freelancing with The Guardian, but has had an extensive career, including places like Nature magazine. So I'm going to let you take it away because we've all over the
Thanks. Okay, well, hello. I was invited here to speak about Wittenoom and my story, which I worked with both Robin and Melita on. But I thought I'd start by telling you a bit about myself. Now, how do I go to the next slide? Sorry. Normally the arrow just works. God, it's really places like this. I know. Okay, so as you've heard, I'm a freelance reporter, but mostly I work at running the journalism program at Murdoch University. I've been nominated for the Hugh Schmidt Prize for Feature Writing at the WA Media Awards next month for my reporting on Wittenoom. So hopefully that comes up. Prior to that, I was a deputy editor at Perth Now, and I also started my career out at the science journal Nature. I'm probably one of the only people in the world that have gone from working for Nature, one of the world's most prestigious science journals, to working for, Sunday Times in Perth. But there you go. I had to come home at some stage. So yeah, I was approached by the features team at The Guardian to write 1,000 words about the cleanup of Wittenoom. And I was quite surprised when the editor said to me that they were going to clean up Wittenoom, because I didn't know a huge amount about the issue. I did know that it was a widespread pollution problem and that asbestos fibres are microscopic. So as you know, Wittenoom is classified under WA legislation as a contaminated site. It's considered the largest contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere. It's basically Australia's Chernobyl. I'm having trouble speaking. So I didn't know what to talk about tonight because obviously we're in a room full of people who are experts in this stuff. So what I thought was I'd just start with a bit of a background so people were all on the same page. So blue asbestos was mined at Wittenoom from 1939 to 1966. As I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, it's one of the deadliest forms of asbestos because its fibres are so small they can easily lodge in the lungs. So WA mining pioneers Lang Hancock and Peter Wright started things there in the lead up to World War II. Because asbestos has fireproofing properties and insulation properties, it was in demand particularly in the military in Europe. It's quite astounding to think that it was put into gas masks. So in 1943, 4 years on, the Hancock Syndicate sold its mining leases at Wittenoom to a sugar milling company called the Colonial Sugar Refinery Company. 3 years on, Wittenoom manager wrote to CSR head and reported the first known asbestosis case in a man named Digham. And that's according to the ASDA. CSI went on to export 165,000 tonnes of raw Wittenoom asbestos. In 1962, Dr. Jim McNulty had a piece published in the Medical Journal of Australia that recounted the first victim of mesothelioma from the Wittenoom mine. But it chugged on for another 16 years before closing its doors in 1968. So during its heyday, about 7,000 people worked for CSR and 13,000 more people, non-workers, lived at the Wittenoom town site. According to the Asbestos Disease Association of Australia, more than 2,000 people who worked and lived in Wittenoom have died since then from asbestos-related disease. So you might know the Midnight Oil song, Blue Sky Mines. That song is about Wittenoom and the lyrics refer to the sugar company that won't save the people. So anyway, here we have this town at the foot of a deep gorge, 15 hours drive northeast of Perth, that's blanketed in the deadliest type of asbestos from mining operations. So where had my editor got the idea that the WA government was going to rid, I think it's 46,000 hectares of the Wittenoom asbestos management area, which is what they call the contaminated site, of asbestos contamination. And I was confused until I saw this press release. So on the 24th of March this year, the WA Lands Minister, John Carey, announced that a piece of legislation had passed Parliament to permanently close Wittenoom. At that time, Carey said, the passing of the Wittenoom Closure Bill is a significant step in resolving the long-standing industrial tragedy that will protect public health and put an end to a dark period in our state's history. Now, Wittenoom, because of the contamination, was erased from the map in 2007. They call it de-gazette. But while it wasn't on official maps, it was on tourist maps, and it was increasingly becoming a famous ghost town. It was a draw card because there were still people and buildings there. Some people were selling souvenirs. You can see here asbestos tailings in the background of this photo. So Melita Markey, who we met from the Asbestos Disease Society of Australia, tells me that up until December 2021, the RACWA had Wittenoom listed as one of its top 8 ghost towns to visit in Australia. So it was taken down after she contacted them. So it's important to consider that this is a beautiful area, this strikingly red landscape with deep gorges at the doorstep of WA's tourism mecca, Karanjini National Park. So the government wanted to stop an increasing number of people exposing themselves to asbestos dust in the name of a selfie. So what this bill did that came out in March was gave officials the power to forcibly demolish and remove the town's remaining 14 buildings. 3 people remained living there when the bill passed. The old mine and most of the buildings had already been demolished and were buried on site. So this was about getting rid of the last remaining structures, but it was not about cleanup. So the Wittenoom Closure Bill does not propose any type of plan or costings to remove the asbestos pollution from Wittenoom. So I told my editor that the fact is that the story, so that's the fact that the story needed to tell, that there was no cleanup. And not just that, that a company related to the people who first started the asbestos mines at Wittenoom had now applied to mine right next door to the site. And I'm turning my pages and forgetting to quick go. All right. So as a bit of background, mining asbestos is a dirty process. Rock containing the minerals are blasted from the ground and then crushed, squeezed and dropped onto vibrating screens to separate out the asbestos fibres. Asbestos fibres are larger, they sit on top of the mesh and get vacuumed up. Denser rock and sand falls through this vibrating mesh and becomes a waste product called tailings. So tailings that are laden with asbestos, and 3 million tonnes of carcinogenic tailings are to this day piled up in 2 gorges in the Wittenoom area. So the miners walked away from their deadly waste product and no one stopped them. And the blue-black piles you can see on the right side of the gorge here is silk-like dust, and that shows some of the tailings that have been left over. So the traditional owners of this central Pilbara area are the Bunjima people, and they won native title here in 2013 after a 15-year fight. So managing the land is their right and their responsibility, but simply drawing breath there can kill them, so they cannot safely connect to country. This picture and many of the others in this presentation were kindly provided to me by Melita. As we all know, she does amazing work and tireless work to raise awareness about the dangers of asbestos and to help asbestos sufferers. So this is another one of Melita's pictures. So if we go back in time again to the 1950s, when the milling operations were spewing this deadly dust everywhere, there was inadequate dust suppression. And the problem for those people living and working there in the 50s was that the whole town site was lathered in this asbestos tailings that we were just looking at. The reason that it was put all over town was because it took the bite out of the dust, out of the heat, the Pilbara heat. So it was spread atop the pavement, around homes, across the schoolyard, on playgrounds and businesses. And it was soft and it stopped the red dust that blew everywhere. And it was piled at the bottom of swings and no one was really aware of the dangers, at least not the town folk. So Melita says that people would order it from their gardens like we would order wood chips now from council. Her dad worked there too. My dad, Robert Towie, worked at Wittenoom. He's hopefully online right now. Hi, Dad. He dug holes in the tailings, he dug holes in the dirt, which were covered in the tailings for buildings footings. He has a scan every 3 years to check his chest for the telltale scarring of asbestosis. So far, so good. So fast forward to now. We have a situation where there are piles of asbestos in these gorges or tailings in these gorges that are exposed to the element. So the bill to permanently close Wittenoom does not address these waste piles that blow in the wind and flow in the streams when it rains. The CEO at the local Shire of Ashburton this year warned an Environment and Public Affairs subcommittee that in heavy rains, these tailings run over a public road used by tourists, miners and pastoralists. He personally wrote to the fire services warning crews of the risks. The problem for his council is that it has already been hit with $5.8 million of legal and settlement fees since 2011. But it's not just council who knows the contamination from Wittenoom is spreading. The former WA Lands Minister admitted so in Parliamentary Committee in December just last year. He said, "It is now understood the contamination extends beyond the boundary of the Wittenoom asbestos management area due to the previous use of tailings for construction and maintenance works in the area, transportation of asbestos products from mining activities along railroad and migration of tailings from the gorges via surface water transportation and other weather events." So at that time, he sought advice from the State Solicitor's Office to determine liability and responsibility for the tailings and contamination at Wittenoom. So since 1978, when the mine shut down, consecutive state governments have commissioned inquiries, audit reports and formed committees to examine this problem. All have failed to remediate the land. So the question I have is why? And the answer is really legally complicated. So who is responsible for cleaning up these gorges that continue to affect the area and the Indigenous people? A parliamentary inquiry in 1994 was unequivocal that the buck stops with the mining companies. 28 years ago, it said, the committee considers that the companies responsible should clean up the widespread contamination that they caused in the gorges and recommends that the state government take instant and determined action to ensure that this occurs. So that was 28 years ago that statement was made. Since then, politicians from both sides of Parliament have called for the machinery and work in place to be used to make Wittenoom safe. But the result of that is a government that has drawn a line or a big circle around the problem and said, do not cross. When the Banjima people demand answers, they're told another committee has been formed. The red here on this Google map indicates the contaminated site. You can see there that the former Mulga Downs sheep station sits 31 kilometres northeast of Wittenoom, just outside the contamination zone. So Hancock managed Mulga Downs when the mine was running at Wittenoom and went on to own the property. Lang Hancock's daughter, Gina Reinhardt, who now runs Hancock Prospecting, has submitted an application to the EPA to open a 20 million tonne a year iron ore mine at Mulga Downs, next door to the contaminated site. So the company, which made $7 billion in profits in 2021, wants to begin shipping ore mined from Mulga Downs by late 2025. Now, you remember that Lang Hancock started the Wittenoom asbestos mine, and when I wrote my article, the company didn't respond to questions about cleanup. Ironically, when the WA government passed this Wittenoom closure bill, it was sitting on $11.3 billion in ironing ore royalties. The WA budget handed down in May this year revealed a $5.7 billion surplus that was pumped full of red dirt royalties. Not a cent was allocated to Wittenoom cleanup. So given both the government and the mining companies involved have billions in their coffers, why is no one stepping up to clean up the site? You remember the parliamentary inquiry in 1994 made up of 5 MPs and staff recommended that the government take instant and determined action to have CSR and the Hancock group of companies remediate the sites and remove the damage that they have caused in the gorges. So why hasn't that happened? It's basically because the whole thing is a complete legal nightmare. Documents reveal that the government suspected in the 1980s that responsibility for the mountains of tailings may lie with the Crown. Now, former Greens MP Robin Chappell, hi Robin, who worked in Wittenoom and couldn't be here today because he has asbestosis and doesn't like to fly because of the damage to his lungs, says the biggest issue stems from a bizarre move by the Charles Court Liberal government to confiscate the tenements from Hancock and Wright for the gorges when the where the mine tailings are stockpiled. So tenements are leases that mining companies, sorry, I need to slow down. Yeah. Tenements are leases that mining companies need to pay the government to mine the land. So Chappell, who has meticulously documented the Wittenoom asbestos issue, says the reason the government did this was because Hancock and Wright hadn't paid the rent due on their tenement. So, but realistically, the area is so contaminated that officials admit it will never be safe. In a statement to me when I was writing my story, Minister Carey said that while the steering committee will be re-established, we do need to be realistic about what can be achieved. Wittenoom is the largest contaminated site in the Southern Hemisphere, and around 3 million tonnes of asbestos tailings were left behind in the gorge and surrounding area. Exposure, as we all know, to a single asbestos fibre can be fatal, which makes it extremely difficult to have full confidence the area will ever be made safe for people to visit, even with significant remediation. So while consecutive governments have failed to stop the flow of asbestos from the uncontained tailings, Melita with ADSA have taken their fight global. Melita says she is fundraising for a multi-million-dollar international competition to clean up Wittenoom. And she told me that she hopes maybe the brilliant engineering minds of the world might come up with a solution to this problem. So that concludes my talk. Sorry if I spoke too quickly. My reporting on this issue, as I mentioned, has earned me a nomination for the award, so fingers crossed on that. But whatever happens, the story of Wittenoom is not done and dusted, despite the Wittenoom closure bill. Thank you.
Do you have any questions at all? Either online or in person?
Another comment, just after that committee meeting in '93, because my parents were heavily involved with Larry Graham at the end of the time, and they did so much lobbying to set it up, and it was such a disappointment when they lost government, because I believe, and this is not a plug, but we truly believe that if we hadn't have lost government then, things would be significantly different now, because there was such a commitment for it. But on the corollary on the other side, there was such a drive to promote tourism in the area, and we've got documents around that. So what you had is they lost government, and all that stuff was shoved away, and then there was a real push to develop tourism in the area, and that's the real shame, because there was so many committed people on that report to create that report with Larry Graham. It was incredible, and yeah, it's just how unlucky. I think we'd be in a very different situation with the cleanup if it hadn't lost government then.
Yeah. Is there a ballpark figure for
cleanup? That's a good question.
Based on the present technology?
So people have estimated, I think Robin Chapel estimated
600 million.
600 million.
But back in '93 it was 20.
Yeah. So there's been costings done by the government in the 80s that have revealed they sort of costed it at 20, but yeah.
But less than $1 billion.
Yeah. Are you thinking about the mining billions?
Well, it's not beyond West Australian government budget.
In terms of the royalties it's receiving from mining.
That's correct.
How would they clean it up?
Well, that's the question. There's been different, Robin's got some thoughts on that. There's been different ideas. I think enclosing it in concrete was one. The problem is that it's just mountains of waste that flow. So if they could stop that, you're never going to get rid of the asbestos in the area, right? Because of those tailings are spread everywhere. But I suppose you could stop adding to it because it is spreading. And
you stop it getting in the water stream. That's one of the areas that we've talked to with the Lands Department in the past about that. They were concerned about trying to stop it going downstream. We've had discussions, and that was with the then Treasurer, Ben White, because he was very committed to trying to solve this problem. And Simon can add to this if he puts his legal hat on. There's 4 main defendants. And realistically, the 4 defendants should really be involved in sharing that cost.
I think there needs to be more discussion and public outrage over it. You can get that one. Okay, cool.
Thank you very much, Narelle. And next up, we're joined by Fraser Brims. So Professor Fraser Brims is a consultant of respiratory and the head department of Sir Charles Gardner Hospital and Professor Curtin Medical School. He's the chair of the WA Mesothelioma Registry and the deputy director of the Institute of Respiratory Health, where he heads the Occupational Respiratory Health Research Group. Fraser has clinical and research interests in occupational and asbestos-related diseases and early lung cancer detection. He leads the WA Asbestos Review Program, the largest lung cancer early detection program in Australia, and is the chief investigator for the NHMRC Centre for Research Excellence, the National Centre for Asbestos-Related Diseases, or NCARD. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and hello to everybody online as well. So I'm going to talk about the record bit of this, I guess. And as we've already heard, asbestos was used in up to 18,000 different products in the last century. The funny Smurfs in the middle there is actually in firefighting suits. Just above it, asbestos was used in the filters for cigarettes, just to combine the carcinogenic properties, and so on and so forth. So widely used throughout countries, and really you can track or look back at the industrial utilisation of asbestos. Really, sadly, looking at mesothelioma mortality across the world, and you can see the UK, Netherlands, and then Australia in that order have the highest rates of mesothelioma in the world, and WA itself has the highest rate per capita in the world, because largely of Wittenoom. One of the major concerns, aside from the Wittenoom site itself, is residual asbestos within our built environment. And approximately 2/3 of houses built between 1950 and 1980 in Australia will have some asbestos in. And this infographic from Lung Foundation is really just trying to raise awareness for people doing their renos and DIY to think hard before you break up whatever bit of it is of your house you're going to be breaking up. I thought I'd just come out with a few sort of statements just to try and, I guess, balance some of the conceptions that are out there. So we've already sort of managed this, but there are different types of asbestos, and the risks of them can vary. So we've heard about white asbestos, which is chrysotile, and blue, which is croxidolite, which of course is what was mined at Wittenoom. So aside from colour, when you look at them under a very, very powerful microscope, you can see they are very different. The white asbestos is kind of curly, bendy fibres, and chrysotile is long needle-like fibres. And it's easy to understand how they can have different biological properties. And we know from mesothelioma's point of view that croxidolite is many times more likely to cause mesothelioma. However, chrysotile will still cause mesothelioma, and exactly the same for lung cancer, which is an oft-forgotten cancer, also caused by asbestos exposure. The reality is, though, that for all those 18,000 products, in almost all cases, the asbestos fibres were mixed together, depending on market values, which was cheaper at the time. So it's a little bit academic as to which one downstream you worked with. If you mined with it, maybe it's a little bit different. So another really important thing we need to bear in mind is that the risk from exposure to asbestos and developing all the different asbestos-related diseases is related to the dose, i.e. the more you're exposed to, the more likely it is to happen. However, it is by no means definite that you're going to get any of the asbestos-related diseases at all necessarily, and that's the host bit. So there's bits in us that vary, and this is all the genetics and all that, the other work that the NCARD researchers and otherwise been working on for some time. So some people are more susceptible than others. We don't have a lot of the answers as to why, to be quite frank, but we know it's definitely the case. And for example, so these are some more images from Wittenoom. So when the mine was running, some fibre samples or air samples were taken. So the F per cc, that's fibres per cubic centimetre. So imagine you've got a dice in your hand, and the handbagger, who's the one in the middle there, shoving the crushed asbestos into a Hessian bag. Those poor gentlemen had the highest exposures. So they had 100 fibres in that little dice. Now, at the moment, we're all breathing over a minute about 5 litres of air in and out. So the function of just per breath and how many breaths we're taking. If I were to very conservatively double that for a man doing manual labour, he's breathing 10 litres in and out, which is 1 million fibres per minute, which is almost unthinkably massive amount. And whilst that is a shocking amount, and whilst it's catastrophic for the individuals and the families, only 1 in 10 of the Wittenoom workers had developed mesothelioma, and only 1 in 10 had developed lung cancer. And that's not to belittle that, as I say, massive, what is a worldwide industrial disaster, but it's by no means a certainty, even when you've had enormous, unthinkably enormous doses. Another oft-forgotten thing is that our lungs can clear out the dust we breathe in. Now, we know from studies many years ago that the amount of fibres in our lungs over time drops. So there's a half-life, if you like, and yes, chrysotile is cleared out faster than croxidolite. However, what that means is that one-off short-term exposures, people often come to me and talk about doing some DIY and they cut through a fence or a ceiling eaves or something, and should they be concerned by a one-off Saturday afternoon exposure? And the simple answer is almost certainly not, because your lungs will clear this out as long as your lungs are in otherwise reasonable health. And the asterisk there, of course, relates to smoking, and these days e-cigarettes as well. So our lungs have a conveyor belt inside them, and they clear out all the dusts and pollens and viruses and bugs and things that we breathe in. However, that conveyor belt doesn't work if someone is smoking. So that's the caveat to that.
So what about the sharpness of the blue fibre? That was always something that we talked about in the past. That has that conveyor belt that sort of interferes with it because of it's just so sharpness.
It does, and there's no doubt that when the conveyor belt is overwhelmed, then fibres get stuck in the lung tissue, and then you get downstream issues. But again, as I say, it's important that we have to put things in context. But you're absolutely right that there's no the fibres do get stuck into the lung tissue sometimes.
Yeah, just that particular the blue because of that. That's what I was.
Absolutely. So as has been mentioned, in 1962, the first case of mesothelioma, at that point actually it was called endothelioma, it changed in the early 60s, was recorded. And Dr. Janet Elder, who's pictured there, was a clinician here at Charles Gardner. And in 1969, she had the foresight to think, gosh, I've seen a lot of what was hitherto a very rare cancer. I'm going to start writing down some of the details around the cases. And this is the first page of what still runs today, the WA Mesothelioma Registry. And Nola, who's in the room, does all the work. Thank you, Nola. But I'm part of that, and amongst a few others. And we have a pathologist look at every single report from biopsies and samples taken to make sure we are dealing with mesothelioma. And then the main reason, amongst others, that we look at the cases is to determine when someone was exposed, and we get an idea of latency, but also what was their main source of exposure? What job was it? How did they come across asbestos in time? This is the most kind of sciencey graph I have, so bear with me. So the number of cases goes upwards on the side and along the bottom, then is going from 1960 through to 2020. So along the bottom there, the yellow is the Wittenoom workers, and you can see the absolute numbers hasn't changed a great deal over that time, but of course the proportion, because so many other people are getting mesothelioma, has fallen. Wittenoom residents has been mentioned, so 13,000 people lived in Wittenoom, and of course, sadly, this involves people who were born and raised in Wittenoom as well, so children. So those are the so-called first wave. Those are the people that dealt with asbestos when it was first mined. The so-called second wave, so those who have worked with it downstream and made it into those 18,000 different products, tradies, construction industry, and so on. Clearly, that's the largest exposure there. An area that's quite rightly raised some concerns is about those doing DIY and renos. Think back to the houses, and certainly a paper that Nola published in 2010 in the MJA demonstrated that we had an increasing rate, not just absolute numbers, but the rate of people who have been exposed from DIY and renos getting mesothelioma, and that's a great concern considering how much DIY and renos goes on in this country, in particular this state.
Found that whole principle about dose related, because when we come across the DIY people, they really haven't had. Yeah. But
Melissa, so say for instance, thousands of people are doing DIY, but only, I don't know, a handful of them will eventually get mesothelioma. So they're unlucky. They're susceptible to a low dose.
Yeah.
That's the key thing. Yeah. So other things just to pick out from the registry is that 1 in 10 cases are not from work. They're so-called non-occupational. And about, so we know that, so that also contains, so 40% of females are not exposed in occupation. So overall, all of the WA registry is 85% fellas, because it's mostly an occupational job. But importantly, 1 in 10 are not. And about half the time of the DIY renos, about 20% of time females are exposed as part of renovation, and the other 20% will be well, the classic one actually is washing their husband's overalls and clothes. But sometimes the history has to extend to, what did your husband do? Oh, he was a teacher, didn't do anything. What did your father do? What did your grandfather do? And it can go that far back sometimes. So that's called para-occupational exposure. So importantly, what we've shown very recently, haven't got it published quite yet, is that, so 1984 was when the major ban of the use of asbestos products occurred. It was an absolute ban that only occurred in late 2003. However, we've only found 4 cases where their first exposure was after 1984 for DIY. And we've shown for the first time that the rate has fallen in the last decade. So the numbers of people against the overall population at risk has fallen, which is really very good news indeed, very significant. So we've got the first evidence really now, after all this time, that that ban way back when has actually possibly begun to have an effect finally, which is very important news for us as well. Question I get asked very often: are we at the peak? So we've seen that great big rise on the graph. We're up there. So I actually also sit on the Australian Mesothelioma, it's called scientific committee or something. I can't show you the data because it's embargoed and we've submitted it for publication, but I can tell you that the Australian rate of mesothelioma has dropped in the last decade. All right, so I think now we probably are at our peak, I hope. It might not be absolute numbers yet, but the rate, the numbers of people getting mesothelioma compared to the overall population has fallen across all of Australia, which is amazing news. That's fantastic news. The remaining question is the peak going to look, well, is the slope going to look like that, or are we going to have a very long tail considering all this residual asbestos that's in our built environment? I used to think it would be looking like this, but when you consider now that we've seen a fall off in the DIY and renovation rates, it may be quicker. I don't know, and we'll just have, time will tell. But I think I would sort of cautiously say that we're very close to that peak, which is fantastic news. Right, 3 key points. We're probably at the peak in Australia, I think, and that's to be celebrated. We have to remember non-occupational exposures, and that's safe. 40% of the time, if a female has mesothelioma, it's non-occupational. And just remember again that it's, whilst it's catastrophic for anybody developing mesothelioma or lung cancer, the risk is dose-related, and there's a huge variation in who gets any of the asbestos-related disease, let alone mesothelioma as well. And that's me. Thank you very much.
One, I just thought we've got a politician, Simon. If we're talking about overall dropping, how do we then talk to people like Simon who fund research with better funds? How do we, because we still don't know about 40,000 tourists a year that were heading to Wittenoom from 93, and we are seeing cases of that, as we know. So, and they're just coming into that 30-year exposure. People holidaying and doing things. So how do we take those numbers and we say to Simon, look, this is happening with bans, we're doing some great work, but how do we then put more money into organisations like NCARD for treating people, because it is very acute. And we also have our Indonesian neighbours, because we were brave enough to get rid of James Hardy. He took his manufacturing to Indo, and now we're seeing those cases over there, because they're over there 20 years, and I think somehow we need to share that.
I think we have a regional, well, the reason I put that back up is there's still a lot of people that are going to develop mesothelioma in the coming decades.
So, this is
so that's important. Yeah, no, absolutely. The other thing is I think we have a responsibility to our region. I haven't shown any of the global statistics, but Russia, bad old Russia, and many other countries are still exporting and utilising millions of tons of asbestos. And India has a trade deal with Russia that they are bound to, and they are exposing thousands upon thousands of their workers and people at home and all those too. So this isn't going to go away. It might be easing off in Australia, but it's not. From regionally, we still have a responsibility, I guess. that's one of many things, but yeah.
To the organisers, as others around the room, I'm furiously texting to get out of my next event. I'm more than happy to answer questions after all of our special speakers, because I don't want to cut across anyone's time. So let's get all of the guest speakers to do their presentation, and then if people have questions for me at the end, I'm more than happy to stick around for as long as you need me to answer all of your questions.
Very much. Right. Thank you very much. Okay, so for our last presentation today, we've got Dr. Melvin Chin joining us. Melvin Chin is a medical oncologist at Sir Charles Gairdner Hospital. He came to Perth after completing his medical degree at the University of Cambridge in 2011. Got a strong research interest in mesothelioma and has explored computational approaches to discover cancer biomarkers for mesothelioma gene expression. He's also a past recipient of the AEDSA PhD scholarship and a current recipient of the RAIN Clinician Research Fellowship. Currently, Melvin's research focuses on machine learning approaches to predict mesothelioma responses to chemotherapy and immunotherapy treatments. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, everyone, for the opportunity. And very good evening to all, as well as everyone online as well. I've been given the task of speaking about research, and that's a very dangerous task, you might say, given that NCARD is a center for world experts in a lot of fields. So what I was going to focus on instead is a patient-centered perspective, as I've titled it. And what I will do is that I will focus on three broad themes which run through the research that we do here at NCARD. And part of it is actually based on the feedback that I've received talking to patients in clinic that I look after with mesothelioma. So looking at research from just a broad perspective, we can say that the research themes here are that of novel therapy. So patients are always keen to know whether there's anything else in the drug development pipeline, whether they're new therapies. Another point about research is how we're personalizing our care for our mesothelioma patients in the future. And of course, how we're expanding our knowledge base, because most of the treatments, if not all of the treatments that we have available now, are a consequence of broadening our knowledge base about this disease. So I'll talk about these three components in detail. So we'll talk first about novel therapies, and just giving a bit of context about mesothelioma, it is one of the more recalcitrant malignancies to treat. So it's a difficult cancer to treat, and we see the consequences of patient suffering, patient symptoms in clinic on a daily basis. What you see on the top diagram is a CT scan of a mesothelioma patient. And one of the difficulties of treating this disease is the fact that it's not just a single entity, but rather groups of multiple entities. And that means that because of that diversity of or what we call tumor heterogeneity, it makes it difficult to recommend a specific cookie-cut treatment to a patient and expect things to work well. So these different subtypes, on the left-hand side, the epithelioid types, and essentially on the right, the non-epithelioid type mesotheliomas, they differ in terms of their treatment responsiveness, and they also therefore give differences in patient prognosis and outcomes as well. Now, more recently, one of the practice-changing events in mesothelioma has been the introduction of immunotherapy treatment. And this is one of the things which now our Western Australian patients are benefiting from. For years or decades even, it was chemotherapy before this, and now we have immunotherapy that we can use for our patients. Immunotherapy is a tool, but there's a difference between getting a tool and learning how to use it well, unfortunately. In the next few years, or the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see us begin to understand how to use these tools well in order to better manage our patients and to achieve better outcomes. So one of the things that is being done at the moment is through clinical trials. So one of the trials that's being run internationally at the moment is to study whether or not combinations of these therapies, chemotherapy and immunotherapy, can provide better benefit for our patients. This is one of the clinical trials that has been spearheaded by Professor Anna Noack, who is one of the mesothelioma research leaders in the world. And essentially, one of the things that this is exploring is if you combine these treatments together, do you get better responses in patients? The most important thing also from these studies like these big studies, is that it's not just a yes or no question that you're trying to answer, but rather, if you look on the bottom caption, that it's generating large volumes of translational data for future analysis and patient care. And I'll elaborate on that in a bit more detail. Now, related to that is the fact that new treatments are on the horizon, and along the theme of recognizing and acknowledging that mesothelioma is heterogeneous, we are now beginning to understand and tailor care to our patients. And we know that based on just how the mesothelioma looks like under the microscope or how it looks like on the CT scan, there are still more subtle or nuanced differences that we're not able to detect at that level. And we have to go down to the gene expression levels within the tumor itself. And one of the things that's being deployed at the moment, there's a rollout happening, is that we're sequencing individual patient tumors in Sir Charles Gardner on site. And we're using that to tailor or to identify whether some patients may have unique mutations that make their tumors more vulnerable to different types of medications other than chemotherapy and immunotherapy. And essentially, some of the patients or friends and family that are here might have had me approach them asking for permission to sequence their tumor, so that we can then understand that there are tumor vulnerabilities to treatment, and perhaps enroll them in clinical trials at Sir Charles Gardner or at the Linear Research Institute as well. Now, what this means, and this is just to emphasize that what we're trying to achieve here is that the gene analysis that we're doing on individual tumor samples would mean that in the future, we might be able to say, this patient 1 has a particular mutational vulnerability, we should give this particular therapy. This patient 2 has a different mutational vulnerability, we should use treatment 2 instead. And that expands the number of treatments and the types of treatments that we can deploy for our patients. Now, I'd like to talk about this related theme, which is personalized medicine in mesothelioma, not only in mesothelioma perhaps, but also across most other cancers. And essentially that theme that we talked about also is something that I'll elaborate on in more detail. And the personalization is not only about tailoring therapy to specific mutations for a particular patient, but the broader research themes, which I'll discuss as well. So personalization is not only about using different stuff. The personalization may happen. We define different levels of personalization as well. And one of the examples that we are exploring is that you might have a patient 1 of a particular type of tumor or subtype of mesothelioma, and patient 2 might have a different subtype of mesothelioma, different from patient 1. And what we're beginning to realize is that there may be differences in the way these patients' outcomes depend on the sequence of therapies as well. So with patient 1, you might have treatment A and treatment B and treatment C giving the best outcome. But with patient 2, you might have treatment B and A first, or treatment B first, followed by treatment A, and then treatment C, in order to derive the optimal outcomes for them. And that sort of sequencing of treatment is an integral part of the personalization. It's not only about diversity of treatments, but also about temporal relationships between treatment timings, between treatments as well. Okay. Now, one of the things that we are beginning to explore is personalization from a clinical, pathological, and genomic standpoint as well. And what we mean by that is that in order to derive that information, what we need to do is we need to leverage multiple aspects of information which are available to us to tailor care. And that means obtaining information about tumor, patient symptoms, pathology, genetics, imaging, and their treatment timeline. And this is where the perhaps the more sophisticated machine learning approaches come in, because what they do is that they are able to condense all of this information that come from multiple aspects, the pathology, the imaging, the electronic health records, and essentially develop structural models, survival prediction models, treatment recommendation models that will allow us to tailor our care. And I'd like to emphasize here that for perhaps the patients in the audience, that this use of patient patient genetic information, their treatment journeys, it is the most direct contribution that patients make to our research. So some patients, when they come into clinic, they lament the fact, they said, oh, I should be contributing to research for future sufferers in mesothelioma. And I'd like to reassure them that with these approaches that we're using, there is a direct connection between the patient experiences and essentially the data models, machine prediction models that we're able to develop, and essentially that their sacrifice and their journeys are actually preserved for perpetuity. and they actually help mesothelioma sufferers in the future. So the knowledge base, and this is the third aspect that I'll talk about as well, because the immunotherapy that's just come into the picture for mesothelioma, all of that is the foundation of that is the knowledge base, and that is generated by the research that we do. And what I would like to emphasize amongst the many forefronts of research that they are is that we're beginning now to focus on the gene expression data. So essentially looking at tumors, looking at blood samples at resolutions which are unprecedented, that we would not have been able to do 5 or 10 years ago. So these new technologies which come under the heading of functional genomics, they allow us to look at patient tumors, patient blood samples, down to the level of individual cells. And this provides unprecedented levels of information that we can analyze and actually use for prediction of treatment responsiveness, prediction of prognosis, tailoring of patient care as well for specific treatments. And I'd just like to emphasize that, yeah, this is one of the places where we will develop in the next 5 to 10 years. And the reason why is if I put multiple computers in the icons on the right-hand side is because most of this information is not processed using a laptop, but rather one or two. Well, it's you need for a particular study or a particular analysis, a person or a group of scientists usually leverage computers which are the size, which essentially are enough to power multiple hospitals, and we use that on a routine basis nowadays for that. So one of the examples of how this information is being leveraged is, for instance, from the DREAM study. So one of the studies, one of the initial studies, which combine chemotherapy and immunotherapy. Those patients who, as part of their legacy, have volunteered their blood samples for this research. And essentially what you're seeing on the screen, and of course the clumps on there, each individual speck represents a blood cell. And essentially what you're looking at is the collective, picture of many patients' blood samples combined. So there are about 400,000 cells in there, and each speck in there can actually be interrogated individually for information about tumor progression, about prediction of treatment responsiveness. And essentially there are multiple questions that can be asked from that. And the amount of information that can be processed, and this is a single study, there'll be multiple studies rolled out here at NCARD in the next few years. But essentially, just to put things in perspective, that particular picture with the information that's contained within is equivalent to approximately 12 million books. And to put things in perspective as well, the Australian National Library has 7 million books. So essentially, the information that we can get from there is formidable, and this will only expand in the years to come. So in summary, there's ongoing research into novel treatments, and I'd like to reassure the mesothelioma patients who see me, as well as mesothelioma patients elsewhere around the world, WA, other hospitals in Western Australia and the rest of Australia, that there is ongoing research into novel treatments on multiple fronts. And we're at the interface where we will see sophisticated technologies and computational methods used to improve patient care. So there is hope, and there is much to be explored, so to speak. Okay, so just for acknowledgements, I'd just like to acknowledge everybody at NCARD. I'm somewhere there, I think, dressed in blue. And as well as that, just an acknowledgement to my supervisors, actually, or my mentors, especially to the ADSA, because they were the ones who ignited my interest in research in the first place. Pawsey Supercomputing, they were the ones who helped me generate the pictures because they provided the infrastructure. Telethon Kids, Sir Charles Gardner, the RAIN Foundation, and of course, the patients, carers, and the advocates as well. Thanks very much for that.
Covered everything, Melvin. Oh, we've got a question online.
There are multiple studies, and the results will be. I think that there are results on the way as well. It is effective in the second line as well. Essentially, this these results, if you think of it, it generates as much hope as it does questions, because essentially now it brings up this whole research topic, or this clinical importance, which is when should you be using it then? Should you be using it in the first line? Should you combine it with chemotherapy in the first line, or reserve it for the second line? Bottom line from the research into second line immunotherapy is that it is still an effective option, but essentially, as with all good results, it opens more questions to be explored.
One more, Melvin. In the case of peritoneal mesothelioma, how do the asbestos fibres travel into the peritoneum?
Yeah, I think this is one of those questions for which I don't think there is a clear-cut answer yet for it, unfortunately. It's and this is in no way trying to be evasive with answering the question, because in the perfect scenario, that sort of question would have to be answered by detailed analysis, tracking these fibers across time, and tracking to see how these patients eventually come to develop peritoneal mesothelioma. And unfortunately, as with all of aspects of our research, what we can do is essentially limited by the logistics and essentially the reality of how we need to be able to answer these questions. It's not possible to track these individual fibers and to form easily a way of seeing how these fibers then create the tumor cells, which then cause peritoneal mesothelioma. And in fact, on that subject, we're even now still trying to understand how, for instance, multiple types of mesotheliomas exist and are created. And that's essentially maybe one of the single cell projects that are going to come that will be done in NCARD in the coming few years as well. So there is work being done. I don't think there's an answer which I'd love to give. Unfortunately, I'm not able to give. But there is.
I might be able to add a little bit to that. Just that conveyor belt, when it comes up, we can cough stuff out, but more often than not, we actually swallow it. So it's possible with simply swallowing the fibers. The other possibility is the glands that are in our chest talk to the glands that are in our tummy, and if the glands get full up with fibers and can travel through the system, that's possible as well. But Melvin's right, we don't know for sure. It's not from drinking it or anything like that, we don't think, but that's probably it. And it's about 7% or so in WA of all mesotheliomas are peritoneal, which is tummy mesothelioma, which carries an even worse prognosis, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I think we could give a big round of applause to all of them.